Okay, everybody, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Once again, I just want to remind everybody, if you haven't signed up on the sheets outside, go ahead and do that, or make sure you do it at the end of this session. I want to thank you all for coming to our panel discussion for Guardians of the Galaxy 4, What Happened to Groot? No, I'm kidding. Actually, you are in Environmental Permitting and Utilities panel discussion. And because my jokes are so good, I'm going to turn it over to John.
Man, you should have stayed up here, Shane. Everybody would have appreciated that. All right, so good. We got a good crowd. So I'm John Jameson with the DOT Environmental Policy Unit, and I am not an expert on this panel, in my opinion. The four folks to my left are. But I'm here to just help facilitate the panel discussion. We want this to be an open discussion. There's a microphone there for questions. Questions are welcome throughout. We are not going to have a PowerPoint, so that screen will stay the same the whole time. Just want to give everybody a heads up. And this session's only an hour. Some of the other ones were hour 15, so it'll be shorter, hopefully. So we're going to talk about how the permitting and utilities interact with one another throughout the process. And our panelists here today, to my left, we've got Chad Coggins. Chad's a double graduate of East Carolina and the Division 4 project team lead. He has a great breadth of experience as a DOT environmental officer and also as a project manager. Been in Division 4 for a lot of years. To his left, Michael Turchi. Michael's the group leader of our Environmental Coordination and Permitting Group in the Environmental Analysis Unit. He's been with EAU for just over 20 years and is a well-versed expert in Section 404 permitting. On down, Jeremy Goodwin, graduate of NC State, go Pack, with a BS in Bio and Ag Engineering and Pre-Med. I didn't know that, Jeremy. He has a career spanning pharmaceutical manufacturing, agricultural waste research and management, and has spent over 20 years with Roadside Environmental, involved in stormwater and groundwater regulatory issues. And on the end, Bo Hemphill. Bo is also a graduate of NC State in electrical engineering and is our Eastern Region Utilities Manager for the Utilities Unit. He's 17 years at NCDOT Utilities and has a number of years of additional transportation experience prior to that. So with that, we're going to just open up to some questions that we're going to talk about amongst the panel. And like I said, open to questions along the way. Obviously, it'll get a bit more interesting and complex as the conversation goes along. So think about what you might want to ask. So let's start off the conversation here. And are y'all good on the mics over there? All right. I'm happy to share this one too. I don't need to hog it. So going down the line, when we talk about permits and utilities, what exactly are we thinking about today? What kind of permits for Chad and Michael?
For sure. The obvious ones, of course, are the 404 permit from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, 401 certification from DWQ, and the buffer authorization for Tar Pam and the Neuse and the Neuse River. That's the ones that come to my head. Division 1 counterparts, CAMA permits would be a part of that. You got any others?
I think you got them all. This can be confusing because when we say permits for utilities, we say it very broad, but it's actually sort of two separate disciplines: the natural environment with streams and wetlands and buffers, and then the roadside environmental component as well. So
right. So Jeremy, for you, when we talk about permits, you have different language down there, so.
Yeah, slightly different, but so our set of roadster plans are actually a environmental permit. There is a state component with the SPCA, and there is a federal component with the MPDS regulations. So having an authorized or approved roadster plan is required for any land disturbing activity greater than an acre. And just to put a caveat with that, if we have Department of Policy is that if we do have other regulatory impacts for 401, 404 type issues, that we ask or require a erosion control plan to be done to help cover that as well.
So on the utility side of things, Bo, just as a reminder, I know a lot of folks in the audience already know what utilities we're probably talking about, but if you don't mind, just refresh our memory of what kind of utilities we're talking about here.
Well, for the 404, 401 buffer permits, all the utilities have to be permitted. Does this help? Yeah.
Yeah.
All of the utilities have to be permitted for 401, 404 and buffer permits. That's your UBOs, utilities by others, which would include all your electrical power, gas, your telecoms, and sometimes water and sewer are done as UBO, sometimes they're in the contract. So for the erosion control permitting, for the purposes of this discussion, we're talking about the UBO utilities because the utilities that are in the contract are automatically covered by DOT's permit.
And when you say UBO, just for some folks in the audience that may not know,
Utilities by others. Those are the utilities that are constructed by the utilities themselves.
okay? Go ahead, fire away, Brian.
So as far as the UBOs operating under our permits and our erosion control, from my experience, Duke has not been willing to do that. So how do we get them back to operating under operational control of NCDOT so we don't have to pay for their permitting and their design of their erosion control?
So that is a very loaded question because there's a lot of parts to it.
Did you pay Brian to ask that question right up front?
I had a feeling it might come up early. And rather than piecemeal this out too much, to answer your question, so most of you all are aware we have a delegated program. As part of that delegation, we still have to abide by all of the state and federal regulations. So we have to fall under those rules. One of the big ones we have is that we don't have a full delegation. We don't have the same authority as like a local municipality or some of the other counties have to regulate land disturbing activities. We are basically limited by the delegation, the fact that we have to have financial control and we have to have operational control. What I mean by operational control is that we have staff that are available to do oversight, whoever's doing the work, and that they can basically shut them down because all of our authority comes from 107.12 out of the spec book as it goes through Division 1 spec book. So without that mechanism, we don't really have a whole lot else that we can force other entities on right of way to comply with. So bring up the next question is how to get that to happen. That is a very long discussion to be had. We may want to touch more a little bit, but that's the beginning of that.
So one of the workarounds, as I'm sure a few divisions has done here, is we take over that piece of the puzzle and let a contract to do that clearing or do it with, maintenance forces or other mechanisms. But we've done that in Division 4 where we've taken on, for other reasons, that was one of the reasons, to actually let a separate contractor do that clearing. And that way we took that portion away, and then Duke could do their work after that clearing was done. So that is something that has been done.
We have several other divisions that are also doing that. Division 6 is doing that on a lot of projects. Division 8 is also doing that. Byron, in other regions? It's happening in several regions statewide.
What was that, Bird?
I said, we're about to attempt it in Division 10, doing an early clearing contract. Michael was helping us with that.
And to that end, and maybe zooming out just a little bit, one thing we hope to convey today is who to involve and when to start these discussions, because every project is different. The utility situations are unique. The utility owners are unique. Even Duke is not consistent across the state. You may have protected species issues, and these are just good things to sit down as early as possible when you establish, we really don't want to move the utilities early on this project. get the team together, sit down, and kind of work out some of these issues, and that'll help develop a realistic schedule. And for some projects, this may be a simple task, and for others, you may determine that, you know what, for this project, it's not worth it for us to move utilities early. So it just really depends on so many factors that we're kind of pulling out here today.
I know for me on the, you know, I'm involved in the NEPA process typically, so I'm earlier on in project development, so I don't deal with utilities directly all that often personally, but I often get the question in meetings from agencies of, well, what are your utility impacts going to look like? You know, what have you heard from the utility companies? What are you seeing on the plans that might be affected? On the permitting side, Michael and Chad in particular, why do we care about the impacts from utilities exactly? What's the reasoning there?
So our regulatory agencies are responsible when they make a permit determination to look at all of the impacts for our projects to their resources. So when we have a project that has the project itself and utility impacts, we have to submit our application for all of those impacts. You may have heard the reference "but for." That's a common term that we use. So we're saying utility impacts would not otherwise occur but for the NCDOT project. So the NCDOT project needs to disclose all of those impacts. There are a few exceptions to that rule, a few nuances. One of them that comes to mind are betterments, utility betterments. So those are utility relocations that would have occurred anyway without our project. But for the most part, the project needs to include impacts. Any impacts related to the project need to be in the permit application, will be in our permit.
I would expand on that, saying that even if they're relocating off the project, we're still responsible for those impacts. Just because the relocation is going outside of our boundaries, it may not be that big of a deal. I had one on a bridge project that would have spanned another 6 plan sheets, and we were able to simply tell the agencies that it would be within the fill along the rest of the road and what the bounds of that relocation were, and they permitted it. So it doesn't necessarily cause you a lot of work. If you have, to expand on it a little further, if you have any sort of utility work taking place outside of your project limits, make sure that you have it included in your study area. And as soon as you recognize you're going outside of the study area, ask to have your study area expanded.
That's another question that we get on the front end a lot is, are the utility fully covered within the study area? You know, it's a common, we get common questions about the study area, but utilities is a big one. For those in the back, there's a handful of seats up front. You're welcome to move forward. And Anamika, can y'all hear okay in the back there? Okay, just making sure. Yeah. Yeah, Chad and Michael in particular, probably. Chad's really good at pushing the mic away from him for some reason.
Just so it's said out loud, expanded study areas can be covered in the consultation. Right?
Absolutely. Wow, there's a question for me, Bird. Yes, we definitely want to make, that's one of the reasons for the consultation is our right-of-way consultations and our construction consultations, which are essentially NEPA and SEPA consultations to make sure that we're sort of still in bounds, are very much meant for those things like utilities that do come up sort of midway through the project and need to be incorporated or at least checked on, just like species updates and things like that as well. Yep.
So this kind of brings up one thing I do want to, there's a delegation agreement is kind of limited to DOT property. Now that could be any property is acquired for the project. And however, it's temporary or permanent, doesn't matter, but as long as it's associated with the project or it's a DOT-owned property, we do have delegated authority to approve erosion control plans. So the question comes when you get off these areas, it's kind of a gray area. We're working on Duke access most of the time, so it's one of those ones you're going to discuss a little bit beforehand to figure out the limits of what's being done off the right-of-way.
That will probably affect transmission line projects the most, relocations. They won't be done on DOT property.
And it may be an instance where Duke will get their own permits separate at that point in time.
Would the same be said, Bo, for natural gas, which often needs to find its own corridor as well sometimes?
Generally.
Okay. Just curious. Okay. Let's see. We have bounced around a little bit from our pre-planned questions, so pardon me while I double check where we're at. So we've touched on a few things here, but one of the topics we wanted to talk about was the risks that are involved when it comes to this. And I'll ask the panel a question. So what risks do we introduce when utilities do or don't work under our permits? And I'll just open that up for all of y'all.
Well, you know, as far as when they operate under our permits, and even when they don't, probably, the but-for is a big piece of that. So if they screw up essentially and violate a 404 permit, the Corps' unfortunately coming after us in those instances. And we don't have operational control. So that is a problem. But, you know, now most of the divisions have a utility coordinator, utility, engineer, staff that can oversee that. Try to get, some of the DEOs and stuff involved with some of that. Try to have pre-construction, meetings with those utility owners and stress all the above, erosion control pieces and things. But it is a risk. But the other side, if they get their own permit, it's a risk as well from a time and money standpoint. So if they're getting their own EC plans, that takes time. A lot of these, Duke probably has their own engineers, but a lot of other utilities do not. So they're reaching out to firms to get that, which takes time. And then if they fully implement a erosion control plan, even when it's not needed, that kind of gray area, that's high dollar, silt fence and things that Duke passes that back to us to pay for essentially. So it's a double-edged sword there. We're trying to work through it, but again, one of the workarounds is letting that to a separate contract. But it is a double-edged sword, and we're trying to, scope, schedule, budget is the point for project managers and DOT as a whole. So it's hard sometimes to work that for sure.
That's exactly it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can you guys hear me from here?
Yeah.
So when we do utility coordination for permitting, sometimes the property is owned by DOT and then others, it's utility-owned property. Is there a directive as to who should be getting the permit? Is it still better for DOT to get the permit and give it to them? I know you touched a little bit about it, but I'm more so concerned about property ownership and the actions. So who should be owning the permit?
Which permit?
The utility,
Envir-
all the permits that they need for the utility.
404, 401?
I'm sorry?
The 404, 401 permits?
Yes.
Okay, we are obligated to get those permits.
I'm sorry.
We're obligated to get those permits under the but-for clause.
Yeah, basically, if the facility is moving for our project, then it's under our permit.
And that's an expectation of the agencies, generally speaking.
Yes.
So-
So that,
Even if they own the property.
Even if they own the property. So you may wonder, what isn't moving for our project? If a municipality comes to you and says, hey, you're opening up new right-of-way, and we need to serve that right-of-way with a water line, we want to put a new water line down your right-of-way, that's not under our project. That does introduce other risks. They have to have that permit before we let. So we have to make sure they get their permitting done before we let.
And I think Chad kind of touched on it, the same thing with Duke Energy. If Duke is doing a betterment, for instance, and maybe they're putting taking it from overhead to underground, and so they're going to do a betterment essentially. They may or may not be part of our permits, but if they go off on their own to do their own permitting, we lose control of that schedule. We lose control of the costs associated with that as well in a lot of ways, and are just essentially waiting on them. Anything to add? I see a lot of heads nodding, but
It's fair to say no one says we can't permit it, right?
right.
So
The agencies are very, very much comfortable with us being on the hook.
consult with your environmental people, consult with the AU. They're a great resource. That they know what needs to be done, what can be done, and can help you do it without you doing a lot of extra work.
Is there any way you can put it under a TUE or something so you can get control through an easement? Or is that something that we really can't focus on?
I don't know the answer to that.
I would talk to Duke.
I mean, just to get control of it, maybe that's not. What was the question, please?
Go ahead, Paul.
You can, just
Is
put
it,
it under a TUE, like a temporary utility easement
so temporary utility easement
on their property.
in order to
Control.
get control of that action. Has anybody run across that situation? I mean, again, a group discussion, happy to hear from. Okay. Yeah.
For you right-of-way folks, that might be in here, if you try that, you might want to limit that TUE, the amount of time it lasts, because that's available to the contractor for the rest of the project, and that might cause some, the property owners to have some problems with that.
Jennifer, you got a question?
Kind of on a different note, but along the topic of budget that Chad was just talking about, I mean, advanced clearing, TUEs, any of these type of things that we're talking about has costs associated with it. And as we're working to try to get better estimates earlier to prioritize projects, how are we thinking about or starting to account for these things in our budgets?
This is from a different perspective, but a lot of this stuff that we're doing, we're just shifting the cost that we would be paying the utility owner back to the department, so we have better control of those costs.
So the cost per, like the preliminary estimate cost per power pole or something, it includes already a factor for those things within it?
Byron raised his eyebrows for those that couldn't see on the front row over here.
I thought I raised them high enough that everyone could see. I'm really not sure, and I think right now, we're having a lot of conversations with Duke about how work is estimated, and I think that would be a good question to ask them, to get a better understanding of how they estimate their work. We would like to, as we move forward with the estimates that we develop, bundle, cook as much of that into those estimates as possible, so we don't have to, on a project-by-project basis, kind of determine at that time whether that's something that needs to be added. Maybe that's something that can kind of be baked into the estimate, so we don't have to quote-unquote think about it each time when we're determining costs.
From recent experience, discussing a couple of issues with divisions, I don't think those costs are baked into early estimates of Duke, because one of the issues arising is that the early estimates get doubled by the time they go out, or tripled by the time they go out and look at clearing, and we can clear less cheaper than they can. Division 6 is clearing as soon as they have enough. As soon as they have enough work for a week, they go ahead and send a crew out to start clearing. So as soon as they've gotten enough right away in an area to work a week, a crew will go out. Division 8 is going ahead and clearing a lot of the project while they're doing their utility clearing.
On that clearing topic, I'm just curious for Michael and Chad, is there some overlap there in the clearing conversation with some of the species issues that we're dealing with and some of the forest areas? Oh, that's right.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very regional thing for
Right.
sure. I know in the east, we have some of those bat moratorium as well. You know, in the colder months, we cannot do clearing more than an acre. I think that's the number, but in the. Per site, right. And then out west, it's a very different moratorium where they can't clear for a dedicated number of months. It may be flipped, I think, or something. But anyway, yeah, I mean, that's part of it too. So that plays into, you know, us letting a contract to keep some schedule ahead of time, and the whole Duke issue. I mean, that's part of the thought process that division goes through when making a decision to let it to contract or to try another means. I think that's the nuts and bolts of that, right?
Yeah, definitely, and that's where, you know, I'm gonna always encourage that early coordination, because that's where we're gonna be able to sit down and establish those moratorium periods, the times, outline what you can do when, but definitely bats are gonna become, as they continue to be sort of a limiting factor, and we're working through what we can to streamline and to be able to predict, things, but, that's definitely gonna come into a tree clearing complication in the future.
And I feel like part of that conversation around the tree clearing is also, you know, the agencies go out and see some of these projects sometimes, and us being able to say that we control that clearing mechanism and have the operation control that Jeremy's talking about in order to get the utilities relocated. You know, there's a progression there that the agencies want to see us having full control of and knowledge of, and you know, also that they can get mitigation out of us as needed, or any other you know, conditions along the way as we're negotiating some of those findings and getting our permits.
And I would add that they've been great to work with when it comes to understanding the complications that we're in, especially with bats and tree clearing. They understand the restrictions, and it's so new that we haven't worked through probably the best management practices that we'll ultimately come out with in the future.
I got a question, John.
All right.
Go back to your first slide.
There you go, Keith. It's there for you.
Kind of reverse permitting, if you will. So there are a lot of utilities that a lot of us work with in North Carolina and other states where they have easements that we are not, you know, they're not going to be relocating. They don't have to go to a different position, a new easement. They're going to maintain that. We're not acquiring over it. But throughout some course of the project, be it for phasing or fill or cut into that easement, they have their own version of a encroachment permit that you basically make sure you're not going to, no more fill over this, no, not this much cut, you know, make sure not this much weight, whatever it may be. What is the department's standpoint on signing on behalf of NCDOT while even though a contractor may be doing that work? I mean, how do you all handle that?
We would purchase a TCE in that area, and that would be the notice they got.
So you wouldn't enter into an agreement, sign their work?
That they should be reviewing that, what we supply them with the TCE, plus all the utility coordination we do up to that point is information that they need and should be taking in.
Incorporate it in there. Gotcha.
As for, I don't think I want to go any farther than that right now.
That's the next slide, right?
Bird, go ahead.
How far in advance can we start the permit process? So talking about early clearing and grubbing to prepare for utility relocation, doing that now. Because we're short on time, we didn't have the opportunity to discuss early permitting. But how far in advance can we start early permitting and still not affect the application of permit during construction?
Yeah, I'll try to answer that one. I mean, basically, we got to have something to permit, right? So we got to have some level of plans. You know, in my career, I've done some corridor permitting, and there is such a thing, right? 25% plans, corridor permitting. But for the most part, we want to see those TCEs or PDEs, whatever, on that set of plans. And that's the point. Even if that project's years in advance, or the let date's way out, we still advocate to get those permits in hand early for right-of-way acquisition and utilities. We never have enough time for those two things. So, as soon as we have that CFI, the same time those right-of-way plans are being submitted, we're asking for permit drawings at the same time frame. I think we can get creative with corridor type permitting and taking some risks as a department of laying out a certain footprint and some offsets and doing that in the future if we need to, if it gets to that level. But I think most division staff really push for early, working off production schedules more than let-driven schedules, and trying to get earlier plans. I think that's what the PDN is set up for, is early coordination, early drawings, trying to get stuff faster. So,
What does that turnaround time actually look like? And I know I tried to sneak this question in when Michael private calls, and he still will not give me what is the turnaround time, really, the review time for permitting?
I'll take it.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on the type of permit, the area. I can give you a whole chart and table, but for the most part, I mean, our nationwides, our general permits, those are going to turn around much faster than an individual permit. So that's where these impacts really, once we have permit drawings and we know what our impacts are, that's when we can make that true permit type decision. And then that's where we can kind of set a time frame.
But we shouldn't assume anything like 3 months or 6 months.
I would assume safely 6 months for a relatively simple bridge project. I think that's relatively safe.
Yeah, some of those things are statutory. I mean, you have to ask your environmental officers or whoever is running the permit. But if you hear things like nationwide permit or general permit, some of that has those 45-day, 60-day windows. And we work with our core reps to push stuff through. I mean, this is all relationship. All the stuff we're talking about today is relationship building, networking, early communication type stuff for sure. Priorities, we dictate, within reason, dictate to the Corps that we need this permit fast, that we're trying to get something accomplished, and they work with us to the best they can based on their workload. But once you get beyond those thresholds to IP, there's a whole set of public notices and things that dictate a much longer time frame. But most of your project, most of your DEOs and things can kind of work with you on those timetables, for sure.
I'll just second that to say, yeah, you need to lean on your environmental experts from a permitting standpoint. Your Michael Turchies, Chad Coggins, Paul Williams, and there's others in the room too. They can walk you through that entire matrix, and it's a matrix. It's not simple. Even for a nationwide permit on a bridge replacement, it could get complicated for various reasons. It could be that the nationwide permits are getting ready to expire, and so you can't get a permit that's going to be valid in 6 months and know that it's going to be valid in 6 months. So there's a lot of complexities to it.
Yeah, I was going to say that. We had a project getting ready to go to left, the nationwide were going to expire within a year. So we switched our permit type to a general 50. So it's a 5-year window. So it covers that. So you have to be cognizant of those type.
Right.
I just remember the core reps covered at least 2 divisions now, some 3, and that workload changes because it's like I got to fight Chad for core rep. They've got their own prioritization, so.
And for those in the room that don't know, when it comes to our regulatory agencies, and when it comes to the Corps, Division of Water Resources, Coastal Management, and several others, Fish and Wildlife, we have representatives at each of those agencies that DOT pays for those positions. So they are dedicated liaisons to this agency. And they, in a lot of cases, know just as much about how to get a transportation project delivered as we do. Travis Wilson at the Wildlife Commission has been doing this for 20 years. I think he knows more about transportation project delivery than I do at times. They're great at this, and they understand the ins and outs of it, and it's a conversation. And Chad, Michael, Paul, all have their own relationships with those representatives from the agencies, and they can lean on those relationships, and they can also predict what their answer is going to be, so that we don't even have to bother that agency sometimes to get those answers. Question in the back?
Yeah, I had a question with regards to permitting, because I know you mentioned about sometimes utilities with their own permit, or where or not it will be our permit. At what point in time do we need to make that agreement? Should that be in a written sort of agreement on there? Because I've had where a utility was unsure about it, they said they're going to agree themselves, then turned around and said, oh, we're going to be on your permit, and then they ended up being some confusion. So I didn't know there was some sort of form that needs to be filled out by both parties before the permit goes through the permit process.
Are you talking about the erosion control permit?
Yes, well, it's for a water line that was going within a wetland area.
So you're talking about environmental permitting?
Yes.
They have to be on our permit. So that needs to be during coordination. The coordinator needs to make sure that all of these utilities are represented on the permit plans, and then that we have permitted whatever impacts they'll have.
So, why are you opening this wetland area for water line? Can you do directional drain without getting the permit from land to land, just don't open first to the wetland area?
Where they were going to be open kind of in certain areas, so that was the issue.
Yep. Go, Jennifer.
It's really hard to hear
Mm-hmm.
the people in the audience, so
Okay.
it makes it difficult.
Yeah.
And just one thing that I've noticed personally on projects that I think I've noticed in the room is the use of the word permit is super confusing because there's environmental permits
Yes.
and then there's erosion control permits, but we don't usually have erosion control permits because we have plans and we operate under an agreement. So, like, is there a standard terminology that we should use for the erosion control certification that's not a permit so that we can separate those two conversations?
Well, it's a multi-part question there.
Jennifer, I deal with 2 additional permits.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, 3.
Which permits? It's very
So-
confusing.
Right. So working down the line, and we'll come just kind of reiterate what we said before, but Chad and Michael have 404 permitting, which comes also with a 401 certification, which some people call a permit. A buffer authorization, which some people refer to as in permitting, and it comes along with your 401 certification. You have a CAMA permit in the coastal counties, and then we have endangered species approvals, which some might call endangered species permit, but it's not actually a permit. So just as a quick summary there, and then Jeremy, you want to reiterate sort of some of what you said earlier?
Yeah, so the erosion control plans are a permit unto themselves. The fact that we were delegated doesn't alleviate the fact that they are a permit. It's fine to call them an approved erosion control plan because that's what you're going to hear as a terminology. But just remember that it is a permit that has to be done and gotten.
It's like our stormwater permit. We have an overarching department-wide permit that gives us overarching authorization to use, but we have to meet all those conditions that Jeremy and Roadside Environmental work under in the realm of that permit. So if we had someone from hydraulics up here, they would also talk about the stormwater permit that we have to meet from the NPDES side. And I see some heads nodding. Did you have a question, Ernie, or?
Well, in addition to the stormwater permit, there's also the FEMA floodplain compliance.
Right.
There's another hydraulics permit.
Right. So, we should probably be thinking about approvals, right? Not necessarily the permit itself, because there's a lot of approvals along the way. They may be formal, they may be informal. Jeremy, you issue roadside environmental plans, the erosion control plans, there's nothing that looks like a permit on a specific project, correct?
No, it's just the approved plan.
Right.
It'll be noted, there'll be an approved plan in the package, and that's basically your authorization to proceed.
And Bo, on your end, you were mentioning permitting. You have things like water.
Well, the utility companies refer to an encroachment agreement as a permit. And then we also have to get an authorization to construct for water, which is referred to as a permit, and an authorization to construct for sewer, which is referred to as a permit. So it gets really, it does get confusing, this permitting world.
I think the best thing we can do is a lot of our units are putting out more guidance and more information. And so I think to be cognizant of those words before the word permit or approval and try to spell it out and remember that whoever's reading that guidance may not know the difference between all of the permits. I think that would help a lot. We're all trying to do that. It makes the document a lot longer, but it also spells things out a little more.
So,
Yep.
So I just want to gain some understanding here more clearly. So there's an overarching permit. When we actually file, it's not overarching permit.
There's not one permit.
I'm talking about, well, I guess section 4441.
Yes.
It's an overarching permit. And we're filing to have that project, specific project, to be approved under the guidelines of that permit. Is that, what's happening?
Authorize the project under those permit conditions.
Okay.
Right.
Authorize the project under those permit conditions.
I'll say in an ideal world, when we have operation control for Jeremy and we have all the utilities known and we know all our impacts, our 404 permit, which includes our 401 certification, would include all of the impacts that are associated with all of that work under that one permit that we get from the Corps of Engineers and Division of Water Resources. That being said, there's other authorizations and approvals along the way that roadside environmental, utilities, and others make happen in order to line all those pieces up correctly.
That they can fall under different categories under that overarching permit, like individual, or general nationwide, or.
Yeah, I mean, that is a great question. That's one I had to learn myself years ago. So what is this nationwide permit? You know, so it is a nationwide permit where they've gone through and selected all these permit conditions and basically done some form of NEPA-CEPA saying this type of impact is at a threshold that is not environmentally significant. So you basically have your answer to NEPA and CEPA through that permit. And then this authorized, if it meets these thresholds of impacts and type of work, maintenance for Nationwide 3 and linear transportation under however many miles that is, under Nationwide 14, you're authorized for that work as a non-significant impact, essentially, within that threshold. And that, right, and then the IP is the next level where the impacts are not quite known from a NEPA-CEPA standpoint. That's why we do our environmental documents, and they do their own analysis in-house. That's why you have to have alternative analysis and things built into that IP application, and then they do their own assessment and grant that permit accordingly under a higher set of guidelines, essentially. That's why it's called an individualized permit, essentially. So, no, a great question. It's something that we've all had to kind of learn along the way. What is,
Yep.
What is this threshold? Why is it called a nationwide permit? And that's why.
And that regional permit that we've mentioned, the regional general permit, there's a few of them, but that's essentially in between the two, sort of. And it's a bit of a handshake agreement with the Corps of Engineers and Division of Water Resources that they trust DOT is going to operate under these conditions. And so they've provided DOT with this particular permit. Our general permit 31 and general permit 50 are only for NCDOT to use. And we still have to apply for it, and we have to get an approval, but it's expedited, and there's a lot of things that are kind of lined up for us to meet those permit conditions and streamline it for us. Go ahead, Z.
what is the threshold between individual permit and nationwide
So-
permit? Could you remind us again?
The question was, what is the threshold between an individual permit and a nationwide permit?
Yeah, when it kicks into the individual permit.
Can't remember the thresholds.
What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put a plug in for the ECAP website, because we've created a whole permit guide that takes you through each one of these, of every one of the permits, and then the restrictions, because a lot of them are location-based, there's a lot of nuances there. It's no longer just a simple this amount like it used to be in the past. So, this will help you figure out all those nuances, figure out what you have on your project, and make a permit determination for that. And the best way I can tell you to get to that website is go to Google and Google NCDOT ECAP, and we'll come right up. The first one on will be the first link at the top of the page.
And to take that to the next step, Heather in Division 5 for you, and Chris Murray and others are going to be the experts to be able to decipher what that chart is telling you, because it's even I've done permitting for 20 years on and off, and I still have to go ask Michael all kinds of questions about what it all means.
Right, the first 10 years of my career, it was a half acre and 300 linear feet of impact. I think that's what it was. It's changed and gotten complicated now, as most things, but depends on where you are and, you know, what type of impacts, all sorts of stuff. And my, yeah. Right.
Paul, you could have come up here and sat. We have an open chair.
Yeah, we have more tools than we've ever had, but there's still a lot of aspects to each one of them.
So, Michael, there are a lot of permits out there.
Yes, there are.
And so sometimes our projects are permitted under more than one.
They should not be.
Particularly utilities may be permitted under a different permit.
Yes, we could use two different nations.
So that's why we turn in separate utility plans for permitting, so that we've got our utility impacts broken out from the roadway impacts. Makes it easier for them to decide that the utility impacts are small and can be permitted under
Correct.
a nationwide permit.
There's nationwide permits specifically for utilities work. There's nationwide permits specifically for transportation work. And there's a bunch of other nationwide permits as well that are for various other categories as well. So sometimes on certain projects, we may have a series of 4 or 5 nationwide permits that we acquire for any given project.
And I'm sorry, I should have said authorized under multiple permits.
So independent utility does not influence that having to do 2 separate permits? So they don't have to provide independent utility even though it's a but-for because of the project?
So the way the nationwide permit program is for the Corps, they're allowed to stack nationwide permits at their discretion. So essentially, if you have one project, they can maneuver their nationwide permit to meet their needs as they're permitting it. We may suggest what that combination of permits might be, but they may change their mind and say, oh no, we're going to use this one over here instead of that one, regardless of what we submitted in our application.
Right, I mean, this stuff is confusing, no doubt. I mean, it's good job security for us. But you know, this stuff is federal code. I mean, this is the feds that's putting out a lot of this stuff through lawsuits and through other things that they have faced over the years, and it's gotten convoluted in the law. You know, the state mirrors some of that, and it's just gotten complicated because of the different, public interest out there. And it is hard to navigate. It gets harder every year. But, that's why we have teams of folks to deal with it. That's why we, pay for some positions in different agencies to help us expedite best we can. And try to keep permitting out of the critical path best we can. But we do realize it has gotten complicated over the years and probably will continue that way. So early coordination, communication, working on bringing utilities in as the PDN suggests is the way it needs to be, for sure. Yep.
Go ahead, Brian.
We talked a lot about like 404 and 401 permitting on projects, but not every project has a body of
Right?
So there is the caveat that a project, you send it to the Corps and say there's no anticipated, impacts, and they can send you a letter back saying no permit required. So that, I guess in itself is a permit, but every project may not have a 404 or 401 permit associated with it, so.
Right. There's a whole conversation that we need to have on those projects, and it affects my side of the house, the NEPA side of the house, because if we don't have a permit required from the Corps of Engineers on a project, then it changes how you might approach the NEPA SEPA documentation as you're in stage 2 of the PDN, early on potentially. So it may help set your schedule. It also changes your risk scenarios and maybe opens up some big opportunities for you schedule-wise.
Yeah, I mean, that's great for those projects that don't have that, but that doesn't negate NEPA SEPA, and that doesn't necessarily negate erosion control.
And John, your last answer got a 10.
10 minutes left, all right.
Do you want to touch on section 10, maybe, because that'll trip a permit too, even if there's no wetlands impacts or anything?
That's right. We try to avoid minimize as much as we can, but there are some situations where just a simple crossing of the water body itself, and section 10 is one of those traditionally waters that are navigable, and the Corps has responsibility for. Those would automatically require a permit, even if we had no impacts to those water bodies. Although they're pretty large, normally we do, but that's why it's always good just to check and get an overall idea of what the permitting needs might be, what the section 7 needs might be. We can just have a better picture early on.
Yep. If somebody mentions section 10 to you at any point, pull your DEO or somebody from ECAP immediately into the conversation, because that changes a lot of different scenarios potentially. Not that it's not a game changer, but it's just a different realm. And we're not used to section 10 permitting on most projects.
Michael, back to clearing. So if there are upland areas and they stay a respectable distance from the wetlands, and I don't know what that is, can clearing occur in those areas prior to the permit being issued?
Right. So that's where section 7 is going to really come into play. Just because an area is no longer or is not a jurisdictional resource, not a wetland or a stream or a buffer, there are still going to be environmental checkboxes that we need to make sure that we're satisfying. So we may have to get into conversations or issues such as we can clear the trees here, but we need to do it in the wintertime. So that's an example. It would be a green sheet.
So the answer is it's possible. Consult with your environmental officer.
It's
And
possible,
EAU.
and also coming to us early will help us set a better schedule for that project, so that no one's out there waiting for that period to occur. We can line everything up as soon as that window opens.
And that can also help you get your utilities relocating faster.
Mike, you did a nice talk on FERC permitting a couple months ago. Can you talk a
No.
little bit?
Bird, you used the 4-letter word that you weren't supposed to use.
Remove this gentleman.
How does that affect the utility relocation? It still has to follow the same.
So your question is, how does FERC permitting affect the utility
It still has to follow the
permitting
same-
process?
Same guidelines for FERC permitting. I know it's with Duke or the regulating agency, but how does that?
So actually, it's really a separate process, and when you're looking at a FERC permit, you have that set boundary, and there's usually very little utilities within that set boundary, because most of the time it's a elevation that's around the lake, basically the elevation of the top of the dam. So there's usually not much infrastructure below that line. So utilities and FERC, and also the licensee, Duke in most cases, also is aware of all their utilities, and so they're already working early on. So that's not as big of an issue with a FERC project.
Jennifer?
So if in order to move everything up earlier, like we're trying to do on these expedited schedules, to me, sometimes it feels like it's going to be unavoidable. And I didn't know if the agencies, if there's been conversations with the agencies about this, or, you know, what's the thoughts on that?
You're right. That could drive up the number of modifications we do, and that's a risk-based assessment. But I think the benefits typically outweigh on that for sure. And priority parcels, right? So that's what we ask our consultants to do. That's what we do in-house with our utility folks. Is as soon as CFI is done, you know, start working through, or even doing CFI, work through priority parcels to get Duke cleared first, and get permits in hand. Even if that leads to mods, maybe it won't affect those parcels. And, you know, forward progression is the way we perceive it. The risk there is mods and having to go back and explain something, have to go back and maybe fix an environmental document or do extra consultation with Section 7. But, you know, scope, schedule, budget is still driving that as the benefit.
So it's really important to have that environmental representative in that discussion to make sure that all that's covered appropriately. As much as we'd love to have Chad statewide, he's only in Division 4. Good. Anamika?
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
I have two comments and one question. The first comment is, yes, involving you guys ahead of time has helped us in a project where we were beyond the threshold of IP, and Nationwide was not quite there, so we were like, okay, what do we do? And then we were introduced to the general permit, and it did work out really quickly. We worked with the railroads who don't like to wait. So it's, I think we got it in hand within 30 to 45 days. So 4 was really nice in working with them. So that's a win. Thank you for that. The second comment was your guide. I was looking through it 2 days ago. It is really an awesome document, but it is big. 516 pages to be specific. And by the time I went to 230, I was like, man. So I went back to the first 2 pages. So everybody should go and look for those first 2 pages. It's a really nice guidebook, and it connects you to those. But the question is, thank you for making that. The question is, I'm a visual person. I could not find, and pardon me if I missed it by flipping through the 500, was there a flow chart there that explains your processes, just like how we have PDN for the flow chart? Is there a flow chart of permitting process, maybe different for different permits, but that would really be helpful if there is one.
I appreciate your thoughts on that. When that document was created, there were a lot of lawsuits going on nationwide, and it was mainly, that document was mainly to the audience of our division environmental staff and the folks in Raleigh, and then even our agency partners started to use it because things got very complicated. I call it a horse's mouth document because it goes directly to where they're pulling their regulations out of. That's why it's so long, is there's not a page missing. If it references you must follow this, then I have that in there. But I think that I think we need to make another one that is more general, easier to read, and not for an audience that does need to pour through all of those pages. With that being said, and I hate this analogy, I need a better one, but our environmental staff at DOT, we've become sort of like tax advisors, where we take everyone's specific portfolio, specific situation, all the protected species, the location, the people who are going to be permitting it, and we make that determination of, okay, and the expiration date of those permits, and we say, okay, this is the best option for you. So I will look into, and I'll probably make some type of better flowing guide, but I don't want it to ever replace your tax advisor, your expert in the field, because there's just so many things changing and there's so many issues that.
You'll still keep getting reading.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's okay. That's what we're here for.
Thank you.
And we are at time. It is 2 o'clock. I just want to make sure to thank Chad. Stepped up to be on this panel last minute based on somebody that couldn't make it. So thank you so much, Chad, for doing this, and thank you for all the panelists. Good job.
think you should be the moderator from now on, John.
I think you taught me a thing or two.
All right, everyone, we're going to break for about a half an hour and come back at 2:30 for tools and tips for KPIs and budget management. All right. You did, actually, John, you did a great job. You really did. Thank you. Yeah, you did great.